Okay, so we've talked about the dual run. Let's switch this up and make this where it's two individual capacitors. So I'm going to change this ladder diagram to where it will show two different capacitors. So what we're going to do is have the run winding powers our capacitor, symbol for capacitor, and then the output powers the fan motor start winding, and then we have another capacitor, and then the output powers the hermetically sealed compressor start winding. So here's two individual capacitors instead of having one dual run capacitor. All a dual run is two capacitors in one housing. It's important to understand that we make sure we change that microfarads. They must match exactly. But we're having the same leg that powers run winding, that leg then outputs powers this compressor start winding. The same leg that powers run winding powers this capacitor, the output powers the fan motor start winding. So it is pretty well the same. Now, I would like to note that most ladder diagrams, even if it's a dual run, will demonstrate it like this because it doesn't care if it's a dual run or a single wiring, it's still getting its power from line one. Either way, to help you understand it. So here in our pictorial, we have one capacitor with three terminals. We're going to erase this, or remove this, I should say. And we still have, we notice our three wires here. What I'm going to do is draw a new capacitor. We're going to need a big capacitor for our compressor. Let's call this 45 microfarad. And we're going to need a small one over here for our condenser fan motor. And let's call this a 5 MFD, their symbol. Just an example. You want to make sure it matches the motor, so it's not that number. And each one of these are going to have its own terminals. So we're going to have a terminal here, a terminal here. This one have a terminal here and a terminal there. Now, if we notice, we have 4 terminals instead of 3, but don't panic, they are the same. The same leg that powers the capacitor, the same leg that powers run winding powers the capacitor. So this leg powers my capacitor, so it's going to power my big capacitor first. The output of the capacitor is going to power my compressor start winding. So we've powered the capacitor, the other side is going to be for the fan motor. Now there's a saying about which one is supposed to be the one to power it, and really nowadays it's not as big of a deal as long as you mount it metal to metal to metal, upright when possible. You pick one for power in, the other one's going to be power out. It's alternating current, changing direction 60 times a second. Now we've powered our compressor. We must also power our capacitor for a condenser fan motor. Two things, I can run a new wire from here all the way down to power it. But if we think about this, if this is line 1, that means all 3 of these wires are line 1, which means this right here is still line 1. So what we're going to do is take a little jumper wire and jumper it back to here. And then we're going to take this and power our start winding. So really and truly, we have still the same number of wires. 1, 2, 3, we just added this jumper wire. This jumper wire connects these 2 terminals together, so now they are C capacitor. It is the same leg that powers is run. So the small microfarad to the small fan motor, the big microfarad to the big fan motor, just like the dual run capacitor. Now in this unit right here, we're going to do that very same thing, although it's horribly ugly, and I'm embarrassed that it's done this way, but it's fast. It's my day off. We're going to do it. So what we have here is 2 individual capacitors. Here we have a large capacitor for a compressor and a small capacitor for a fan motor. So to make things simple, we know that the brown wire that's on fan goes to our fan motor start winding. So I'm going to put it on this small capacitor right here. Okay, that one's done. And then over here for this larger one, its term goes to our compressor start winding. We're going to put that on the large capacitor here. All right, so now our outputs are there. And we know that this is the same leg as run. This powers my capacitor, so I'm going to power the big capacitor first. But I got to get power to this little guy here. We have a few options. I can, if I so choose, to run a new wire all the way from this terminal. But if we notice, my wire is too small, it won't reach. So this wire right here is still line 1. So I'm just going to jumper off, connect it, and I'm going to connect it to this wire right here. So here we've shared the terminals, kind of messy, but we've shared the terminals. The same leg that powers run winding powers the capacitor. The output of the big capacitor powers the big compressor start winding. The output of the little capacitor powers the little fan motor start winding. Now I've replaced a dual run capacitor with 2 singles. This works really well, and what you can do in a unit, it's going to fall. but we can cable tie them together, make them nice and neat. We can modify our mount it metal to metal to metal, upright when possible, and it's going to work. We already have the little jumper wire in here. In my service truck, I always keep a little jumper wire. The big one is going to go to the compressor start winding, and the small one over here is going to go to the fan motor start winding, and then the same leg that powers the run winding powers both the capacitors, and we have them together. Now what we can do, it's all right, demonstration purposes, served its purpose. I've connected this wire together. So this is the same leg as the run winding. So I'm going to power this larger one first. So this is the run winding, powers the C capacitor. I've connected these two terminals. If I took this jumper wire off and soldered these two terminals together, I'd be left with 3 terminals. These are now 1 terminal, and that'd be 2, and then 3. So just like a dual run capacitor, I have 1, 2, 3 terminals. They label this as C capacitor, so you know that this is the same terminal. Then they label this one fan, so you'll know it's the smaller capacitor going to the fan start winding, and they'll label this one Herm, so you know it's the bigger capacitor to the bigger start winding. And then what they do in the factory is they do something pretty magical. If you take these 2 capacitors, and what you do is you hit them together hard enough and just really, really knock them together really, really hard, they actually will come back together as 1 capacitor. So you have a dual run capacitor. Obviously, it's a joke. Please don't write me an email complaining about that. C powers my capacitor. Herm is the bigger one going to the compressor. Fan is the smaller one going to the fan motor start winding. Dual run capacitor versus 2 individuals. They really work exactly the same way. I do like to replace, if it's out of warranty, I like to replace a dual run capacitor with 2 individual capacitors. For several reasons. I can stock more of these on my truck. I know that having 2 separate capacitors is more surface area. It's going to stay cooler, and if one goes out, it won't take the other one out with it. So I've had a really good success. The brand that I like, I'm getting no endorsements, no money for any of this. The brand that I like is Amrad Made in America capacitor, good quality capacitor with quality assurance. I've never had an Amrad capacitor go bad yet, although anything in America fails. Anything made anywhere in the world can fail. I do love their capacitors. Either way, you can replace a dual run with 2 individuals. You can replace 2 individuals back with a dual run. It is completely doable. And that's our next video. Next, we're going to go talk about replacing different motors. We have some different options with wiring.